Good morning. Welcome everybody to this TPI's virtual learning and networking event on partnering for philanthropic impact with Zurich Foundation and the J&J Foundation and their partners Praekelt and Concern Worldwide. My name is Jenny Ekelund. As I say, I am the project lead for partnering for philanthropic impact. I'm based in Oxford, where the TPI office is. If you haven't come across TPI before, it stands for the Partnering Initiative, and we specialise in connecting organisations and supporting effective collaboration and partnering for sustainable development. So I wanted to just give you an idea of some of the geographies we've got here represented on the call. I know there will be some people joining late as well, but in terms of the people that signed up and the people we're expecting, I wonder whether we could just see the first slide of that. Dave, if you could share that for me. So we've got a nice range of participants from all over the world. It's a shame, of course, that time zone wise this doesn't work for the US or Australia, but we're hoping that we'll be able to share this recording with colleagues and do similar events in the future. And when we asked people to sign up to this, we also asked if there are any particular questions that they had, and we just included a few interesting ones here because I think there's a bit of a theme. So people asked, how do we give grantees more power to provide constructive feedback and become a partner at the same time? And this theme of power came through as well from somebody else asking, what makes a partnership go beyond just the words you use? How do you create something equal when money is involved? I can't pretend we're going to answer that conclusively today, but it's an interesting one to keep in mind. How do we minimise overlap of resources, and how do we ensure that no one is left behind by the projects supported by foundations? So some really interesting questions came up from people signing up to the event today. If I could see the next slide, please. So I just wanted to share with you as well the kinds of areas that participants are working in. So down the left side, that's where 2 to 3 people said that their organisation worked in this area. So again, I haven't mapped this against the SDGs, but if I were to, I think we'd probably cover off, if not most, if not all of the 17. So if we could go back to the opening slide again, Dave. Thank you. So I wanted to just outline the agenda. It's a very simple one because today is all about peer learning and sharing experiences. So I'm going to stop talking shortly after I've given you an introduction to the programme. And I will hand over to my colleague Darian Stibbe, who's Executive Director of the Partnering Initiative, who will introduce our speakers. And there will be ample time afterwards for questions and answers. So what we'll do is we'll have the Zurich case study first, followed by questions and answers. Then we'll have the Johnson & Johnson case study, followed by questions and answers and discussion between everybody who is presenting. And we'll close. So we're scheduled to last for an hour and a half. I wanted to just give you a few points on Zoom housekeeping as well. And I'm sure there is nobody on this call who hasn't been involved in several hundred Zoom calls over the last few months. So I'm sure everybody's pretty familiar with it, but there are sort of different formats for running these things. So we have chosen to run this as a meeting rather than a webinar. So do feel free to keep your video on. It will help us to maximise the interactivity between speakers and the audience, but you're also not obliged to do that. If you prefer to keep it off, then that's fine. When we get on to the questions and answers, please do make use of the chat box to add any questions that you have for the speakers, and we'll be working through those, and Darian will make sure that they're asked. And please also just use the chat box for any links, interesting conversations, things that you wanted to mention to other people on the call. It's a space for sharing and learning, so please do use that. At the end of the session today, we'll ask if you'd like your name to be included for networking purposes. And if you would like that to happen, then we'll ask you to put your email address in the chat box at the end, and we'll collate all those and send it round after the event. A recording will be made publicly available as well on our YouTube channel, so you can share that with any colleagues that might have missed it. You're invited to keep the conversation alive on social media as well, so please do tag TPI as @TPI Global, and the Zurich Foundation is @ZFoundation, and J&J Global Health at J&J Global Health. Perhaps we could just go back to that slide as well in a moment so that people can see those tags. That would be great. I just wanted to ask a bit of a question as well. So we're going to test the interactivity a bit before I outline the story of how this programme came to be, and we hand over to the case studies. So for this poll question, it's interactive, so you'll need to get ready to answer. I just want to know how people are feeling today. So wherever you are in the world, and Twee's just going to share that with you, and you should see the question up now. How are you feeling right now? From $0 to $1 million. You should be able to answer. Okay, well, we've got some people who are feeling extremely energetic today, $1 million ready to learn. I would say the average is not bad at all to superb, so that's pretty good. And quite apart from the fact that I think these online polls are quite fun, I think it's really interesting that we still associate good things and feeling good with multiple amounts of money. It's obviously something that we're starting to move away from when we're talking about impact, and for a long time now in partnerships as well, we've recognised that effective partnerships are not just about funding. They're not just about the money that you're bringing to the relationship. They're about so much more. And they're about the combined resources, non-monetary as well as monetary, that all the partners are bringing to that relationship. And I just wanted to share with you the story about how this really came about, this programme. So I think it was probably the Sustainable Development Goals that really shifted the conversation in terms of international development. And intrinsic to the SDGs is this idea that no goal can be achieved without all sectors of society playing their part, their essential role. And if we don't have collaboration within and across sectors at an unprecedented scale, then we're not going to achieve them. And I think within the overall system, foundations have a hugely important and unique role as partners, as funders, as drivers of innovation, but also as catalysts for collective action. And during 2019, we had quite a number of interesting conversations with different foundations, both corporate foundations and private and family foundations, about how they were both working in partnership with grantees and seeking to do that more, shifting away from this traditional approach to grant making, but also how they were supporting multi-stakeholder partnerships. Some were struggling with that and what it means in practice. They wondered how to maximise the additional value created through it. And how to adjust the nature of the relationship, particularly given issues of power balance. Most of the foundations that we spoke to were questioning if they were optimised and had the right competencies and tools in order to partner effectively. Were they fit for partnering? And were their grantee partner organisations fit for partnering as well? And almost without exception, foundations were looking for better tools to be able to measure the value add and the increased impact that their partnerships were delivering. So all this combined then, these interesting conversations, for a bit of an appetite for a peer learning programme, which became the Partnering for Philanthropic Impact programme. And we launched in March 2020 with pioneer members Johnson & Johnson Foundation and the Zurich Foundation. An important part of this initial inquiry phase was for J&J and Z Zurich to work with their partner organisations to do a fit for partnering assessment. So work with TPI's framework to look at whether the culture, the processes, the leadership, the management were all supportive of institutional partnering, sort of establish a baseline that we could then work from. So as well as being useful to those organisations who will then take recommendations forward to improve their partnering practice, that also provides us with some really interesting in-depth case studies to really strengthen practice in collaborative working across the sector. So that's going to be phase 2 of the programme, taking what we've learned from those case studies, combining it with some of the insights that TPI has found when speaking to others in the sector over the past few months. And I know there are some friends of the programme on the call today who've helped us with that. And the next step is to think about how do we respond to that? What are some of the tools, guidance, practical, concrete things that would help foundations and their partner organisations to really maximise the effectiveness of their partnerships? And we're going to be opening up that second phase in September, so any foundations that want to get involved as member foundations are able to do that, and we'll also be moving ahead with developing those tools. So I just wanted to share, before I pass over to the main event, a couple of interesting things that have come out of what we've seen so far, which seems to apply across the board. Firstly, as partnering practitioners, it was really striking to us, having worked with many different actors wanting to step up their collaborative working, just how much freedom foundations have to manoeuvre and engage in partnering, to set their own direction. And this really led to a range of interesting partnering models. So it ranged from very interesting techniques in order to establish trust, trusted relationships with grantee partners, to seeking to become a catalyst, really, for transformational change. And those two things really are quite different, but we're producing some quite interesting results. And that many foundations have resources available to foster partnerships beyond their funding power. Coming back to this point about the emphasis no longer in any way being just on the funding. And less evident non-financial levers can be particularly powerful. And we came across many cases of corporate foundation staff, for example, volunteering and assisting in that way. Capacity building, or we had smaller foundations who really were interested in partnering because they wanted to amplify their impact. Perhaps they didn't have a huge grant pot every year, but they saw this as a way to really amplify what they were doing. And I think a really interesting one that came out of the COVID-19 crisis is that we saw that it really is possible, despite there being a power imbalance, and that's inevitable to an extent between foundations and grantee partners, it is possible to create strong trust-based relationships, which leads to better collaboration. And we were noticing that foundations that had those strong trust-based relationships with grantee partners that had been built over a number of years were far more able to move in an agile way to respond to the COVID-19 crisis, to pivot what they were doing, and to be extremely responsive, because they didn't have to go through all that due diligence. It was already in place and trust was a given. So I thought that was really interesting. Lots more there to explore, but I'm keen that we get into hearing from people who have been working at the coalface on these partnerships. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Darian Stibbe, who is Chief Executive of the Partnering Initiative, TPI, to welcome our speakers. Over to you, Darian.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you to all of the participants here today on this webinar. It is going to be, I think, an extremely interesting discussion as we delve into the intricacies and the challenges and the joys of collaboration between foundations and their partners. This is a really important opportunity to see a little bit behind the scenes, and to be able to sort of we're delighted that we've got two foundations with their partners who are really willing to share, to give their experiences, to be reflective of the practice and the challenges around foundations and partnering. Those two foundations are Johnson & Johnson Foundation with their partnership with Praekelt.org, and then the one that we're going to hear from first is Zurich, a corporate foundation with the Zurich insurance company, and with their partner Concerned Worldwide. So we have David Nash, who was almost 30 years, I think, with the company originally. Towards the end of that, he was working on their flood resilience community programs, and then came over to the foundation, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago, where he runs what is a really highly ambitious Flood Resilience Alliance, and we will hear, I'm sure, about that. And then the partner, Amy Rose McGovern, welcome, and working for Concern Worldwide. And this is a global NGO, mission to eradicate poverty, where whatever it takes is their strapline. I like that. I like both the ambition and desire to just get stuff done. And Amy is responsible for developing opportunities with the private sector, and has worked around the world with the Irish Foreign Ministry, multiple different NGOs. So we have two people with enormous experience of development and of business, and look forward to hearing now, I think starting with David, to hear about your experiences together and also the experiences of Zurich as a foundation trying to become as fit for partnering as possible. Over to you, David.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's nice to be engaged in something which I think is very dear to our hearts at the Zurich Foundation. We have been trying to think about and explore the way in which we evolve our relationships with our grantee partners over the last 10 years or so. And what I'd like to share with you today is a little bit about where we're currently at. This is not the end of the journey. There is still some things that we need to evolve and develop even further. Just a little bit of background. As Darian said, I'm responsible for the partnerships with our Flood Resilience Alliance partners. The Flood Resilience Alliance is a collection of 10 entities. We have research partners, we have community-based organisations working directly at the coalface, and we have Zurich Insurance Company as a partner within that alliance as well as the foundation. So 3 or 4 different kinds of sectors represented across this alliance of people, all brought together with a purpose of trying to move the dial on community flood resilience. We started our work in flood resilience back in 2013. Our partnership approach has evolved considerably over that period, taking learning from the first 3 or 4 years to alight on the way in which we do it now. Just a little word about the foundation. The foundation is not just a Flood Resilience Alliance or the flood resilience work. We actually have kind of broadly 2 strands of work that we do. One is this global-based partnership approach with the alliance. The other is to support Zurich businesses wherever they are in the world to better connect with their local communities. So we work alongside the local business to identify suitable issues, usually in the space of well-being or inclusion, and find appropriate partners together, which we can then kind of join together in a 3-way partnership in many ways. That's generally speaking driven from the local business rather than from the foundation, but the foundation obviously has a key role to play. Now, the partnerships that we have in that space are very different from the partnerships we have in the alliance space because of maturity more than anything else. So I'll talk a lot more about the alliance, which is kind of where our biggest strides have been. Thinking about the alliance, as I said, it's 10 different organisations and coming from very different sectors, and that is very deliberately designed to try and tackle what is a very complex problem. If you think about the idea of how floods impact on communities and the way in which different elements of communities interact, you need to have different perspectives and different points of view to really understand and get under the surface of that. And so we brought together these group of partners that want to change the way in which community flood resilience happens. We operate broadly in 3 or 4 different spaces. We operate in the research space. So we've got academic partners that investigate and understand or try and understand what the flood resilience space looks like and brings that learning into the picture. We have community partners who work directly on the ground, looking to try and learn from what they're doing on the ground. We have the business that brings a risk expertise element that can add value and insight to all of that kind of piece. And we try and make sense of that through a communication and advocacy strategy. Now, each of those places it happens differently for each of the different partners. They each contribute to their strengths in the spaces that make sense for them. But in order to coordinate that, we bring together the partners that have an interest in those things in a workspace, work group, that looks particularly at things like research or advocacy or community programming. Those work streams are led by one of the partners. So we've kind of tried to devolve the leadership of those things directly to one of the partners, who then takes responsibility for coordinating the work in that space. All of those work stream leads are brought together in what we call a team leader forum, which enables us to look for synergies across the different workspaces, and also to look for duplication to try and avoid wasting our energy and our money. And all of that reports into an accountability body, which is representative across the whole of the partnership, which we call our alliance management team. The structure of this is very much designed to maximize the capacity of each of the partners to contribute to the overall. So rather than a more traditional approach where Zurich or the foundation or both control everything from a centre and push things out, here's the money, go and do something, why haven't you done something? It's much more devolved to try and bring in the capacity of our partners to try and make things work. A couple of other things to mention about it in terms of the approach. One is that we take a longer term approach. The flood resilience work is set up for at least 5 years. The first phase was 5 years. The second phase is another 5 years, actually looking to extend for that out a little bit further. And at the end of that, if we haven't finished what we're doing, then the chances are we'll continue to go. So we have a very long-term view rather than a short-term quick hit kind of win. The other thing to say is that we try and approach these things with our partners on an adaptable basis. So rather than having a fixed idea of what we're going to do at every step of the way, we have an overall goal, and our intention is that we set off on a journey towards that goal and continually review and reprioritize what it's going to take to get to that goal. And we try and do that in a kind of consensus way. Why would Zurich do that? Why would we take that approach? Well, to me, there are three key things that I think comes out of this, which benefit, which are to our advantage as well, and why we want to do it. The first is that we get more out of a partnership by devolving the kind of the leadership of the group. We are able to create some form of synergy where the sum of the parts is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. We combine all of the knowledge we've got together from all across the sectors, which allows us not to just do the same old interventions, but to think more clearly about what those interventions could be, to bring in different insights from different sectors, to evolve potentially a different way of doing things. And that innovation is where we feel we're going to make a real difference on the ground to do that. A good example of this is the way in which we approach doing programming. We set off with a view that said we need to measure the impact of this stuff, but what we've ended up achieving is a process whereby we conduct a thorough analysis before we even decide what we're going to do. So we know what the goal is, but we don't know what the intervention is until we have done a thorough analysis, which is fully funded, which is supported all the way through the process. The benefit of the analysis is it gives us indicators to measure against as well. The second thing is that the shared leadership of this thing gives shared ownership. One of the benefits, I think, of creating this environment whereby each of the partners can take responsibility for the delivery of parts of the programme is that there is a greater chance that they'll own that outcome, that they'll feel connected, they'll feel it's our programme and not Zurich's programme. And that's a great part of bringing people with you and getting the most out of them. So I feel that this shared ownership coming from shared leadership is where it comes from. And the final point is about shared credibility. Whilst I hear frequently from our partners that it is useful to have a corporate sector standing by their side on platforms, it's useful for us to have partners standing by our side when we're talking in the philanthropic space as well. If we want credibility that we know what we're doing and we're working with the right people, and that we have an approach that is valuable and that other people might want to learn from, it's great to have the partners alongside. And it's great that Amy Rose is able to be here today with us to be able to share her perspective too. I'm going to stop at this minute because that's from my perspective. If I can throw this over to Amy Rose, she can perhaps share with you her perspective of where we are.
Just before you do, thank you so much, David. Can you just give a 20 seconds on the overall goal of the Alliance? So just to give people a feel for what the overall goal is, unless, if that's all right, just somebody's put it in the chat. Sure.
So from the point of view of what the programme is intended to do, our intention is that our vision is that nobody should be negatively impacted by floods. So that's kind of what we're looking to try to shift the dial on. The underlying that comes down to the fact that we believe that there is a lack of focus and resources pushed into this space, into the pre-event resilience building space, and our intention is to try and shift that dial. So we have a target that we're aiming for of trying to leverage an extra $1 billion of support into the flood resilience space over the course of the programme. So it's very focused on what we're trying to achieve.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, and Amy Rose, let's hear from you as a partner. Let's see, be interested to hear how much you reflect the same experience as David in terms of that journey and the sort of the change in the nature of the relationship to a certain extent.
Sure, yeah. So as you kindly mentioned, Concern Worldwide is an international development and humanitarian organisation, and we work in 23 countries at the moment, and we deliver both development and emergency response programs. So just I suppose to speak to a couple of David's points on a little bit more generally on the sort of the value of partnership for an organisation such as Concern, and then I suppose you'll probably see Concern obviously as part of the Flood Resilience Alliance, and you'll see a lot of parallels of what David mentioned in terms of valuable partnerships, or the value in partnership that we see from Concern, and why the Alliance is such a great fit for Concern and why it works for us. And then I might just sort of illustrate that with a few more specific points of how that translates into, what are the benefits, the co-benefits of being part of the Alliance. So I guess from an organizational perspective, like an organization such as Concern, the working in partnership, the value of that can be, for example, like increased impact. So Jenny, you mentioned transformational change, and we all know that transformational change doesn't happen overnight. It's not achieved by simple solutions. We work in some very challenging environments, some very fragile countries, and Concern does focus on working with the poorest and most vulnerable. And so complex challenges do require comprehensive solutions. In order to do that, having access to a multi-year engagement and also multi-year funding potentially is really important to develop those comprehensive solutions. And so in order to build learning from a program that's being delivered and to feed that back into the program, there's great benefits in having that sort of deeper engagement as opposed to just funding only. Working with a partner that can bring a new skill set or bring a skill set that we don't have within Concern, or a different perspective, but also a partner that works that can understand the complexities or appreciate the complexities within which we work, and the opportunities and the challenges that we face in difficult contexts, is a really huge benefit, and a partner that will be willing to resource a program accordingly. And so that flexibility, that sort of shared interest and shared understanding is really, really important for us, and it adds huge value to developing or designing a program in a complex environment. So that's kind of related to innovative solutions as well. So Concerns have been, we've been able to apply innovative solutions to difficult problems as a result of working in partnership with organizations, other organizations, and that, you know, that sort of brings in the point of how the Alliance is a collection of very different types of organizations. You have private sector, you have humanitarian organizations, you have academic organizations, and having that perspective, that variety of skill set, variety of expertise to collaborate on a challenge can really transform the way that you approach it. And while we do work, we work very much with communities at a local level in Concern. That's, I mean, we directly implement. Local challenges are very much related to global challenges in many, many ways. And we don't work in isolation. These challenges don't happen in isolation. So solutions do need to be, you know, when you come at it from with a range of different perspectives, you can come up with very different solutions. And that, you know, that is in the context of what the Flood Resilience Alliance is trying to do, preparedness for climate, you know, climate change risks, climate events. You know, it's very much a global issue with a local consequence. Another very, very valuable part of working in partnership is the networks that it gives you access to, and gives everybody access to, not only for ourselves as the partner, but also the funder or the organization that we're working in partnership with, the access to different networks for a variety of different reasons, and depending on the priorities or motivations of each of the partners. So from our perspective, working within the Alliance, we have access to, you know, like a broader network of humanitarian organizations that we know and we've worked with in the field, but working with them at a global level, but also, you know, accessing the networks that are available to us as a group or as a partner. And that can be for advocacy purposes, so to amplify the messages that we advocate for. It can be for fundraising purposes, it can be for skills building purposes, so, and also just to allow us to access sort of how others approach common problems. That's really hugely beneficial. And I guess in the context of all of that I've just mentioned, working with a like-minded partner on a common purpose is really, for us, is the secret to success. You know, really the fundamental core of good partnerships is being able to bring diverse resources together and to achieve more impact, greater sustainability. But doing that with a like-minded partner that has a common goal is, I think, is what really greatly increases the chances of success. And we've seen that, and I guess the SDGs kind of gives us that common reference or common language with which to work with organizations that are very different to Concern, or from the private sector, or you know, foundations, and that allows us sort of the framework within which to work together in order to frame that partnership. If it's okay, I'll just maybe give some very specific examples of why Concern is, like, you know, this particular alliance is really beneficial to Concern.
I wonder if we could, sure. If I could ask you a question instead, and maybe because it's great to hear this. It sounds like there's a different type of relationship that you have with Zurich than you might have for sort of traditional funders.
Yeah.
And what we want to know is, I mean, from both sides, I mean, from your side, David, what did you have to go through as a foundation to change the way that you work and operate to be able to work this way? So you've got this, you're giving longer term funding, you're not telling them precisely what to do. Excuse my cat. You are giving them leadership and ownership. That must be challenging from your side to have to change the way that you work. And I think, Amy Rose, perhaps also from your side, changing the way that you work, having to work with a foundation in a different approach. Sometimes it's easier. It'd be great if they could just come and fund our project and we can just go and do that. And actually changing the nature of the relationship can be quite a challenge. I mean, maybe to start with you, Amy Rose, about how you've seen that change in the nature of the relationship, whether that's caused any difficulties, and then I'm going to ask David the same question.
Yeah, you're right. It is a very different way of working. Like your traditional way is, of working with them, like just directly with, say, with the grant. You submit a proposal, you have a few phone calls, you have some update calls, you have some reports, and you speak to the funders sort of halfway through or at the end of the year that they're funding the program within. Very, very different to how it works with us and Zurich, and there is there's a lot. We work a lot more closely together. We are very much partners in this, in the sense that the development of the program, the learning that comes from the work that we're doing. Actually, it's in Bangladesh. I didn't mention that it's with communities in Bangladesh. All along the way, it's like we're working together on this. So if there are challenges, or there are successes, or there are just ways that we need to change, very much working in partnership. So discussing these, Zurich have been very kind of open to just accepting the realities of the program, and not being afraid to take on a challenge, and not being afraid to talk through the solutions. There's a lot more flexibility in that approach, I find. It means that you're more communicative with with the person who is funding the particular program, because you know that there is, with the way that Zurich works is that the funding is agreed, and this is sort of the nature of how the flood resilience works, is that the analysis is then done, following which we identify what activities we actually need to do with those communities. And so that's a really, really unique way of working. In the proposal, we did not identify exactly what we're going to do with these communities. Zurich were willing to be flexible and to put in the time and the resources needed in order to understand, take the time to really understand what communities would need to apply sort of a data collection, really in-depth data collection phase, exploratory phase, and then develop the interventions, which are then the activities. So that required quite a lot of trust on their part. Obviously, there was, they accepted Concern as a partner based on due diligence and knowing us to a certain extent. However, it did require that Zurich had to trust Concern that we would have the capacity to implement the types of activities that would be identified post-contract signing stage. So that was for us, for them to put their trust in us, I think was then, like developed more trust in terms of partnership. So then I suppose just to come back to your point, yes, it does require more time engaging with the partner, like with Zurich. However, there's a lot more benefits that are gained from that. And so, it's not just, it's beyond a financial contribution. We gain, while we're interacting to that extent with Zurich, we are gaining from their insights, from the the background that they bring as as individuals, but also then from the other organizations in the Alliance, we benefit from that in many ways too. So it's a kind of a, you're giving more time, but you're getting more out of it. And then as a result, also the programs are designed in a completely different way.
Like any partnership, it needs to create added value for it to be worth the additional transactional costs and investments. Thank you, Amy Rose. David, just very briefly, if you could just give us an idea about what you had to do internally in the foundation to set yourself up to be able to work this way, because I know that the first iteration of the Alliance, it wasn't quite giving as much value add as you were hoping. But you deliberately changed the way that you're working and operating. Can you give us just a flavour on that, and maybe the struggles that you might have had internally to make the case for this type of approach?
And the struggles we continue to have. The reality of the first phase is that it was very much a it's set up from the point of view of, we know what we want to achieve. We've got some existing relationships that we can talk with to see whether or not they're willing to or able to come with us on that kind of journey. But we pigeonholed what partners could and should do. So we had this idea that we would bring together different sectors, but we very much said, well, we're choosing you because you're going to do this for us, and we're choosing you because you're going to do this for us. And so we kind of set ourselves up.
Relationships.
Absolutely. And we set ourselves up as kind of this spider in the middle of the web, kind of casting out and saying, right, you guys, we've got you guys, and we can connect you to you guys. So we'll send out a little streamer that way, and then we'll send out a streamer that way, and all this kind of stuff. And what we found with that is that it took a huge amount of effort internally and created nothing in terms of a synergy around the partners. Because we had the relationship, the relationships across the partners were really hard. There was nothing in their agreements that they would work that way. There was nothing in their initial intention that they would work that way, and so on. So we very deliberately, as you said, made a different decision as we extended the flood work into a second phase, and we deliberately did it partly because from a capacity point of view, we didn't have the people that we needed to manage all of that and make sure all of it worked from the center. So how do you manage a complex multi-partner kind of relationship when you don't have the resource in the center to do it? And the answer is you try and understand why you need that resource in the first place and delegate it, release it, if you like, share it with other people. And that's enormously based on trust. We needed our partners to be the kinds of organizations who we understood, who we had a relationship with, and all of the partners that we have within the Alliance, we have a history with before the Alliance started, so that we built up that understanding of who they are, to understand when they say, we will lead that for you, or for the Alliance, that they're capable of doing that. And you have to build that relationship, I think, over time. And I guess the bilateral relationships allowed us to make those connections and be able to learn from that. Creating the structure was fairly easy in that sense, in recognizing that we needed to do something different, we needed to widen capacity, we needed to take everybody on a journey. We needed to make sure we were all aligned on that journey as well. And this is some learning we got from the work we did with you guys back in the kind of middle stages of the first phase, looking at this idea of having a clear direction, having an alignment of some description, and ensuring that we were all pulling in the same direction in the first place. And that was also a determining factor about whether people were part of the Alliance or not. Internally, it's not been, it's been largely driven by individuals. So I've had this view for a long time that we in a funding position have no real understanding of what it takes to deliver on the ground, which is why we need partners who do have that understanding of what it takes to deliver on the ground. We may well have a resource, we may well have insight we can add some value with, but ultimately you need the skill and the expertise of partners on the ground to be able to deliver. And the only way you bring those two things together is to try and harness them in some kind of shared responsibility. So from a personal point of view, that's been part of my DNA and the way in which I've approached things. And effectively, I fought for doing that and wanting to do it in that kind of way and trying to influence others around me. And others in the foundation are kind of bringing that to bear. So, you know, it's about influencing what's happening in the foundation. It's not easy to give up power in these relationships. And it's not easy for others to accept power. So we still have some issues where we've got me sitting in the room as the funder with other partners around us trying to make a collective decision. And there's almost a temptation to say, so what does the funder really think here? Where should we go with this? And it's trying to fight over that and just trying to give the sense that genuinely, there's a genuine need for us to do this collectively. There may well be an overriding casting vote. There may well be a veto if things really can't go in the right direction. But that's all about setting the ground rules to see where we stand. And so far, I think we've managed to create this kind of consensual approach to doing things, which I can sign up to, even if it's not quite what I thought it was going to be, and which the partners can sign up to, where they perhaps didn't think it was going to go quite in that same direction. And I think that's about the way in which we're building those relationships and building that trust. Internally within the organizations, it takes a lot more. We have a lot of conversations with finance departments, particularly, who are used to reporting on grant funding in a very particular way, in very particular time frames, based upon log frames, based upon contracted agreements, all this kind of thing. And I walk in and go, yeah, you know, we don't quite know yet. And they're kind of, and you get the panic-stricken look on the finance department's face as you try and say to them, look, just think of this as core funding. What would you do with core funding? You wouldn't have to allocate every last penny at every last stage. So let's be just a little bit flexible about this. But it really freaks people out to try and take that. It's definitely a journey.
And I think that's a really good expression of a journey. And what's so interesting is that it's both the external journey with your partners to try and build this group of partners who feel empowered, who take the leadership and the ownership to collectively drive something forward, but there's the internal journey that's required as well to change your foundation as an organization to be able to work in this way. And then we're going to move to the second case study, and it'll be very interesting to hear the similarities or the differences when we look at J&J's partnership with Praekelt.org. And for this, we have Marion Birnstill, who is the Senior Manager of Global Community Impact at the J&J Foundation, who's worked for over a decade in the global health arena, promoting social change, collective impact, and sustainability. We also have Debbie Rogers, who's the Managing Director at Praekelt.org, based in South Africa. Praekelt.org are experts in digital health. And I asked Debbie just now about how long they've been partnering with J&J, and it's for 9 years, I understand. So you're almost getting up to your decade anniversary. So great, let's hear your experiences and any reflections you also have around the experiences of Zurich and Concerned Worldwide.
Thank you, Darian. Really glad to be here, and a warm welcome, obviously, to Debbie. It's the first time Debbie and I meet, so it's a part of the partnership, which typically is managed by a colleague, but it's great to expand my own worldview of what we do internally as well with our partners. Although I know the partnership really well, Debbie and I never had the chance to meet. So it's a great opportunity here. So warm welcome and thank you for the invitation. What I'll do, probably similarly to David, is walk you through a little bit of the journey. It has been a long journey. So I'll walk you through in a few minutes where we come from and where we're hoping that we're heading, and some of the key learnings we've had along the way, some of the failures that we've had as well. Not sure yet about successes, but hopefully that will come through at some point, but at least I kind of outline what we've learned. So you mentioned, Darian, I joined the foundation a while back, has been now 9 years almost, so far too long. I always feel it's time to move on, but yet I have the feeling I've had many jobs into one, and obviously started quite young into the foundation, and really had an opportunity to be on that journey and to see the kind of organizational change and change management processes that have happened. And what I try to outline today is the where we come from. When I started, was a foundation that was very conservative, I would say, in its approach, and we had a strategy which was quite fragmented over different health thematics and health topics. And the approach, I would call it, let all the flower blossoms. It was really embrace beautiful partnerships that are out there, wherever they may be, with whomever they may be, as long as they're kind of health related and in connection and focus with the strategy at the time, which again was a very, very broad strategy. So that's the context as I arrived in. And also from an organization perspective, there was great diversity in the way the foundation would be in touch with the business. There was great diversity on the way we would approach partnership across the globe, because it's a global community impact team. And we have a foundation that operates for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And that's the foundation that I'll kind of talk about. But I will also kind of zoom out at some point and talk to you about the broader global community impact, which is all the work that J&J does across the globe. So moving forward from when I arrived and we let all the flower blossoms towards 2015, 2016, where there was change in leadership, big changes internally within J&J's business and governance, executive committee members that really voiced desire to marry much more closely the work that we're doing in kind of global health and the work that J&J is doing from a business perspective as well, and making sure that the synergies are harnessed and that we're a lot more strategic in the approach. That's when we changed two things. One, the strategy, and really gaining a lot more focus and zooming into the capacity building of health workers. Although I see that strategy as a little bit of an onion. There is the narrative that we tell the world, which is we support nurses, midwife, and community health workers. And then if you kind of peel the onion, what we're trying to do is strengthen the bridge between community health and primary care as a way to achieve universal health coverage. So that's a lot more. Now we're entering more the health system strengthening perspective, which, you know, comes kind of the core of the onion with universal health coverage. And if you kind of peel the onion back a little bit more, what we're ultimately trying to do, but we're not talking about it in so many words, is we're really trying to create a lot more resilience-based health system by, you know, shifting the focus towards really general public, towards community health, building resilience within individual, within communities, and within the health systems through frontline health workers. That's the kind of the core of the strategy, although, you know, nobody talks about it in those terms, and I just noticed I'm being recorded, so I should probably not do that. But that's, I think, my take on, you know, the peeling of the onion and the strategy that we tell the world is quite different with, you know, ultimately where the intervention goes. The second thing that has changed is the approach on the how. So at the same time as we shifted the strategy and the what, we also shifted how do we approach the partnerships. We moved from bilateral partnerships to partnerships that are much more ecosystems of change based, or, you know, we see them as a change ecosystem that we're trying to leverage and trying to incentivize our partners to work together. So back in 2016, we had a working group that was created globally to look at the 500 partnerships that we had running globally. And the attempt, and I see Debbie nodding, she was probably also part of that assessment, but the attempt was for a working group to which I was part of, a working group of a few global colleagues to assess the 500 partnership and to see, are they still fitting the new strategy? And if they are, fabulous. If they're not, is there an opportunity to shift and pivot what we used to do with our partners towards the new strategy? Do they have that kind of flexibility to move towards where we want to be organizationally and strategically? And really, where are some of the best strategic fit, the strongest partners with the strongest legacy, with the strongest trust, where we really feel a lot more comfortable to go forward with them and to shift and pivot. So we cut down towards less than 100 partners at the time. So we had a significant, what I call not very elegantly cleaning up process, which was necessary for just realignment with the new strategy, but also bringing our partners on that journey of what do we mean by ecosystems of change. I heard David mentioning letting go of control, and basically what we're trying to create, we call them hubs. They're very locally rooted ecosystem where we let go of control, nominate a backbone organization that is supposed to co-create change locally, align with our strategy, but sometimes even further. The idea is to find partners that are willing to collaborate and have mutually reinforcing activities. I guess it won't come as a surprise that the approach was the need to fight fragmentation externally, because we had a lot of partners that were working in similar fields, in similar geographies, and that just felt strong duplication already within our portfolio, let alone, you know, for other actors' portfolio. So as much as possible, we're trying to align with governments. But again, it's both an internal alignment opportunity as much as it's an external alignment opportunity. It did have a lot of implication from a governance perspective internally as well. The team was completely reorganized, and it still is. It's a constant tension between expertise and the flexibility of letting go and letting partner, move forward on that kind of transformational or systems change journey. And that's really where the Center for Health Workers, the Center for Health Worker Innovation comes into play. We call it CHUI, which is not very elegant either. But the idea is to provide us with an umbrella that covers globally all our work that supports frontline health workers. And it really gives us a lens to harmonize our communication, our positioning globally. We have a foundation in the US, a foundation in EMEA, and then we have different teams working towards the same strategy. And it became quite difficult to make it all come under one. So that's how the center was born. So I think I mentioned probably the most important. I'll probably leave you with a few thoughts before I introduce Debbie. We are trying to take a 3-year outlook, although sometimes it goes beyond that and it's a 5-year. What we found when we did this big assessment of the 500 partners is we had many partnerships that were ongoing for 20 years, but there were yearly renewal of grants. And there was almost implicit expectation that these things will carry on, which, you know, we had to phase out very responsibly and carefully. Some partners were too heavily reliant on J&J funding. So it was a very healthy process for us to go through. We are setting up steering committees that are really devolved within those hubs and ecosystems of change that are the governance behind all the strategy being set up, and also the reviews that David was talking about. Typically, there is then a J&J person part of that review process on a yearly basis to see, where is this heading? Is it heading the right direction? Are we really aligned with government? Are we being taken over by government's agenda, and so on? So it's still a work in progress. We only operating like that in a few geographies. So we have now a hub that is being set up in Kenya with the government. There is some work ongoing in South Africa, and it's really getting some momentum in Jordan and in Lebanon. I'm working on something more in mature market and in Europe, and it's been really incredibly difficult to have partners work together. So still work in process there. But as you hear, it's really around collective action and impact. And as David was mentioning, we're starting from, where are the strongest partners, like, the Praekelt of this world, and how can we support them to move into the systems change field. If they aren't already, what would they be needing, or what support could we bringing them to really get there? So with that, I will probably say that we have a long way to go, I think, internally, because everything was so emergent, both on the what and the strategy and on the how. And that's why this exercise is so important to us, to point at disparities that we may have from a geographic perspective, from a process perspective, and that really kind of hopefully lays the ground for us to accelerate our internal systems change in competencies. I never know how to say this word, on expertise, but also from a governance perspective. I think there's a long way to go from a governance perspective. As mentioned, I'm really delighted to have Debbie here, and I'll say what I know from the partnership, and maybe Debbie, if you can pick on on what I said and maybe give you a perspective on the journey. It has been a bit of a painful one for some of our partners, and I don't want to shy away from that because it has been many years. It has been very iterative, and it has been painful for us internally, and I can absolutely I can recognize that it may be sometimes painful from an external perspective because we were not always the clearest. But the way I perceive the partnership with Praekelt, and it has always been somehow, in my periphery. But we start with a partnership around Mom Connect, which probably Debbie can speak about, a mobile-based way to deliver relevant messaging to pregnant women, and the first few years of the child, but really keeping connected and making sure that people have the literacy and the health knowledge to really thrive. And that's in the shift towards the new strategy has become Nurse Connect. And Praekelt has been on that journey and has taken on board that our strategy has shifted, and we are not targeting mothers anymore, but we are targeting frontline health workers. How can they make their work relevant to this new strategy? And then finally, most recently, I would love Debbie to kind of outline how has that now entered the systems change with some work happening with WHO in light of COVID-19, and how has all those parts of the journey led to where we are today. And again, any reflection that Debbie you may have on failures, on challenges, I think we can learn a lot from those. And I leave it to you, Debbie. I think I was far too long, so I apologize.
Thank you so much, Marion. That's hugely interesting. Thank you very much for being open about the challenges as well, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And Debbie, can I just pick a couple of the things that Marion was suggesting, which is not so much about the programs themselves, but the nature of the change of the relationships with the foundation, with J&J. Be really interested to hear about that journey, and the challenges that's created, but also the opportunities that has opened up. That's what would be really interesting to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Darian and Marion. So I think it has been nearly 9 years, and the relationship has evolved over time. And I think I'm going to reflect a lot of what Amy Rose suggested was why their partnership with Zurich Foundation was so important. Is quite similar. Is that I think that J&J strikes, or certainly in my engagement with them, strikes a really good balance between some funding partners who will give you the grant and then they see you in a year's time when you do a report, and others who feel that they are in fact a client and you should just do exactly what they say, and there's no flexibility. It really feels like they've struck a good balance between these two. And the way that I would see that happening is that they're willing to engage, but they also actively engage around things, but they don't feel that they have to control everything that we're doing. It's a conversation, and I feel that I'm perfectly able to say, actually, I disagree, and this is why I disagree, and we're able to have a conversation and get to a point where we actually, I think, come up with some agreement. I think it's very interesting to reflect on what Marion said now, because you can imagine that we've been a partner for so long, when a foundation goes through a change in strategy, it can be very nerve-wracking for the partners involved, because you're not sure if what you've been working on for this time is actually going to fit into the new strategy. How does it work? I think what was really amazing about that process is that it wasn't hidden from us. It wasn't something that happened behind closed doors and was sprung on us later. We were actually actively involved in discussions and asked questions about how it would impact us, what we think. I felt that I was able to work with J&J in evolving this strategy, and so at the same time was able to think about how I might be able to evolve the strategy of our organization to align, if I felt that was the right way to go. And so I think that kind of engagement through the process of re-strategizing was really amazing. And I think, it's brave to be able to take the feedback from people who might be feeling defensive or worried, to be able to take that on, I think is really incredible. And I think the other thing is that, always understood that the work that we do is a journey, that it's not like you can, I can put together an activity list of exactly what I'm going to do in 2 years' time. The world changes, political situations change, the technology itself changes, but it's more about aligning on objectives and being very adaptable and discussing how we're going to get there. And when I've had to come and say, look, there's been this situation that has really scrambled what we thought we were going to do. This is how we think we might be able to adapt. It's been a discussion to see how we can actually get to the best objectives based on that, rather than, you know, feeling like it was something that was a failure on the part of ourselves or our other partners. And so I think that that's really been amazing. And then, you know, the J&J have also been really interested in partnering in ways other than providing funding. And of course, you know, as a nonprofit, funding is always top of our minds. But you know, we've had, we actually currently have a J&J employee seconded to us to help us in a certain area of our business. And we've been able to work with some other commercial teams on the J&J side, like the behavioral science team, to help support and improve our work. And I think that's always been very nice. And again, the way that that's evolved, it's not forced upon us, but it has offered us support, and it's been a massive support to us to be able to have that additional engagements. And then I think, you know, just back to what Jenny mentioned at the beginning, and I know Marion mentioned it now, when COVID started to become a priority in South Africa and globally, you know, J&J not only were very open to our suggestions about how we might adapt what we're doing for COVID-19, but actively approached us to see how they could support the work that we're doing. And I think that again is just a testament to the flexibility and that partnership. And so I think that it's been a journey, but I feel like I've been taken along the journey, both in a macro sense of the work that we do, and in a micro sense of the work that we do, and a macro sense as to the evolution of the strategy of J&J. I know Marion mentioned, you know, that there are some things that might still need to be changed, and I agree, it's not perfect. You know, there are a few things. I think one of them particularly that's important for me is longer term commitments to funding. It's very hard in the nonprofit space to be able to keep excellent staff. I'm fighting with Facebook for my engineers, and they're not having to put you on a fixed term contract. So being able to get a slightly longer term view of what funding might be available is really important. And I think that that's an area that J&J have been and will continue to work on. And then a little bit more around supporting of the organization rather than just implementations or projects. So I think, you know, as particularly as partnerships evolve and you start to prove that, you know, it's not just about this one project, you can adapt and you can continue. It's very important, particularly for nonprofits, to have people invest in core funding, that it allows you to accelerate the organization as a whole and not just an implementation that you're doing. And I think that that's a really important. There needs to be a mix, I think, for funders between core and implementation funding, and really organizational core funding can be completely catalytic for organizations such as my own. So I think that's another area that I think J&J should focus a bit more on. But obviously with 9 years, I can hardly, it's a little bit nitpicky, but it's been a really great, and I think collaborative and mutually beneficial relationship to be working with J&J. That's how I would characterize it.
Debbie, thank you so much. So it's given us a really good glimpse into that process, and I think in both cases from Zurich and J&J, the way that you've gone about that journey, the importance of keeping the trust and the relationship with the partners, the engagement in that process as you go through the change is clearly something that you have in common and something that's clearly been extremely important. Another thing that you've had in common, I think, is really about setting a strategic direction and having the clarity about where your organizations want to see action and results, but not necessarily having exactly the answers to exactly how to get there, So you're allowing work with your partners to do that. Interesting, Jay. So Zurich, of course, you've managed to get your partners working together. In a sense, you have almost formulated the second phase of the alliance around the idea that we have this goal, and you're kind of bringing partners around that goal. J&J, Marion, it's interesting because it's almost the opposite. You sort of started with partners, and now you're trying to get them more aligned and working together. And I can tell you that is a huge challenge if you start from that side and then sort of try to get them to work together. When we worked with the Vodafone Foundation a few years ago, and they tried to do this, and they found there just wasn't sufficient overlap of interest or geography. There weren't sufficient synergies compared with the competition between the different grantees. So it's interesting. There are challenges there. The other difference I'm also seeing is Zurich about deliberately looking at longer term funding, whereas it sounds like, if I've got it correct, J&J is still at the sort of annual funding with multiple different partners. Or I mean, Marion, tell us more about how that works. And then basically, I'd just like everyone to pile in with their thoughts and suggestions and questions and comments. So Marion, just respond on that. That'd be helpful to know how your partnering works.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it's unfortunately it's one of those things that hasn't been really harmonized. So within the EMEA Foundation, we have leeway to do 3 to 7 years granting process. So we just go ahead and do that. Unfortunately, when it comes from the corporate J&J budget, there's less leeway to do that. So I think it's very much reflecting on internal governance. And depending which pot of money the partnership comes from, and it's the case for Praekelt, I believe, it comes from another budget than our kind of EMEA Foundation budget. So it's not harmonized. I guess the foundation in EMEA has been granting on a more longer term perspective as the rest of the organization, but there are reasons for that, and I think there's some significant hurdles that make it difficult for the rest of the global community impacted to grant differently.
And in fact, we've seen something similar. Sometimes it's with the difference between sort of endowed foundations or corporate foundations, where corporate foundations are not allowed to commit beyond the annual,
correct.
Beyond annual, because they don't know how much funding is going to come from the company, depending on how the company does. So even the governance aspects are really important.
Yes.
David.
So just on that very point, I mean, we as a foundation are funded on an as and when basis. So we don't have an endowment. We're reliant entirely on the business to provide us with a payment periodically. And so far, we've been able to shift them from this funding us on a kind of once a year approach to making longer term commitments. That's quite tricky for a business to commit to because effectively they're committing future year profits in current year, which affects current year profitability. So there's a whole kind of process to go through to get to that point. So we're still a work in progress. But to suffice to say that when we come to making grants, we effectively take what we know we've definitely got and committing that over a long period of time. So what that might do is that might limit the number of things we can do, but we'd rather do limited number of things and use the funds over a longer period of time, because we think that's where you get a bigger impact, rather than hope that money comes in when the business says that it might be able to give us money. Does that make some kind of sense? It's definitely a learning journey, though. It's not something that evolves overnight.
Yes, no, very interesting. And I don't know if people think of foundations. They think of foundations. They will have vast amounts of money, and they can't understand. Actually, there are internal governance, internal controls, and rules and bureaucracy. We always say, foundations, they can be really innovative in the way they use their money. Actually, in many foundations, that isn't the case. We've had one of the questions in the chat has been around bringing in other funders. into collective impact efforts, you will note that this particular program we're running with, this collaborative program with foundations, isn't explicitly looking at foundations working with other foundations, collectively funding things. Part of the reason is that we've seen that it's extremely difficult in general for foundations to work effectively with each other in collective impact projects, with some exceptions. But I'm wondering, Marion and David, if you just have any thoughts about that, about collectively funding with other organisations.
Well, I think if I was to look at the opportunity more than anything else, I think it makes a lot of sense for when the corporate parent is aligned, for the corporate foundations of those parents to start to think about how they could align in a collective kind of response. I think one of the challenges, and I was actually talking to a colleague this morning about this, one of the challenges we face is that a lot of the kind of the corporate relationships that Zurich have are, you know, they could easily be seen as very kind of trust-based and long-term and all of that kind of thing, which is a good business to customer kind of relationship. You know, you need to build these kinds of relationships with your customers to secure long-term arrangements that are beneficial to both. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you align thematically. So the fact that we insure a particular kind of business doesn't mean that their interests and what would make sense to them as a business would align with our interests and what makes sense to us as a business. So I think that there is a real difficulty in the relationships that we actually could leverage. Those relationships aren't necessarily aligned if you see what I mean, and that makes it really hard for our corporate foundations to say, hey, we're interested in doing this, and they can go, oh, we're interested in doing that too. One example, one of our customers we worked with, we had a 100-year relationship with them over time, so it's a really long-standing relationship, and we tried to find a way in which our flood program could align with work that they were doing. Couldn't find the geography where we worked together, we couldn't find an interest where we worked together, we couldn't find an opportunity basically, and it kind of fell by the wayside as an idea. And this was a relationship which is really deep, I just think this is just really hard.
I can imagine. And Marion, from J&J's perspective, for the new hub you're creating in Kenya, is that also funded by other organisations, other foundations?
Yeah, there are a few organizations that have been invited to join. There hasn't been any formal commitment from a funding perspective to date. I think what we see currently is some activities being scaled through other funders, so being picked up once it's kind of has proven its value. So you know, we have recently activities that were picked up by UNFPA and UNICEF jointly to scale in 23 different countries. We also have some of our partners that are implementers that sometimes put money on the table, which is quite rare, but the likes of the Aga Khan Development Network, sometimes if we settle on a proposal together, they may pitch in and put their own funding on the table to accelerate some of the work. And then finally, I guess it's given how narrow our perspective currently is from an interventions perspective, what I see more and more is our programs being submitted for matched funding to the likes of the EU Commission, or our partners are more actively seeking additional co-funding from the Grand Challenge Canada, DFID, or European Commission.
Great. So it is possible to bring in these other ones, and I think for your ambitions, of course, that's what you want. You're trying to build up something that then becomes a sort of sustainable centre that J&J helps to develop, but you don't want to be the only funder for that forever. Otherwise you simply won't get sufficient impact. We have just 3 minutes left of the discussions. So Amy Rose, you put something brilliant in the chat. And well, I'll tell you what, why don't you read what you put in the chat, because it's a beautiful soundbite, a beautiful quote.
I just didn't want to ring the thought process while everybody was having a discussion about something else, but it was something a point I wanted to make that you kind of picked up on, and it's just about how, you know, when the power dynamic, I think, is something that was mentioned at the start, and how do you break that down and how do you address that? If it's a true partnership, then each party has something to offer, something that is considered of value to the other. And so how do you do that? How do you bring that value out and allow each partner to actually add that value? You have to empower them to add that value. And that's something that David explained a bit about the structure of the alliance. So Concern actually leads on one of the work streams, the community programming work streams, which allows us to have, you know, a certain amount of decision making and leading in a specific area or specific work stream thematic area. And that's been very positive, I think, for the dynamic. That's really empowered us and allowed us to bring out, you know, what to add our value in a really true sense. So that's been very positive, I think.
Great. Well, why don't we take that as, if I'm going to want to get 1 point from each of our panelists, just sort of say what has created, what they see as the most created success in this shift towards more partnering work. And perhaps that's, Amy Rose, perhaps that's your one, really, about devolving that power and trusting and delegating the lead is certainly one of them. Debbie, Marion, David, what's your one thing that you would say if you're advising other foundations? Debbie.
I guess it's probably along similar lines, but I think, you know, both sides of a partnership, and this includes those of us who are receiving funding, and I think it's important to understand it can't just come from the funders, but it's about mutual respect and engagement. And I think that if you can have open and honest conversations and you can both be clear with each other about where you're going and how you want to get there, rather than trying to hide things from each other, I think that's just going to ensure that you have much longer term, more effective partnerships.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Marion, David, Marion.
I guess for me it would be holding space for complexity. There is always a lot of complexity, and within partnership we're very often trying to kind of narrow it down and box it and make it, you know, this is the money, this is the intervention, this is the outcome, this is the impact. Unfortunately, it never works that way and never works in isolation. So I think the attempt with the hubs is mostly allowing for that systems change conversation to happen and just put some of the bigger question on the table and not shy away behind a grant application and say the money will solve it, because we all know that's not going to be the case. So I think holding space is probably would be my last one.
I love that, holding space for complexity. Brilliant. David.
And the last thing, I guess, from me would be that I think is the critical thing for me about partnerships is alignment. If what we wanted to achieve, what we were setting out for strategically, was not going to align with the partner's ultimate strategy, and this is at an organizational level. It's not necessarily for this particular program. It's much more about saying, if you are heading in a particular direction for a particular reason, are we on the same journey? Are we heading in the same kind of direction? We don't necessarily need to have identical outcomes, but are we going in the broad general direction? And if we are going in the broad general direction, well, we can become fellow travelers and we can move together towards those things. So when I'm saying I'd like to do this, you're saying that makes sense to me and I'd like to do something similar and work alongside you. So I think that alignment is critical. If you don't have alignment and you have people peeling off and saying, well, that's the direction they're kind of going, so maybe we can throw a line over and link to, then you get tension within the whole Rhino relationship and it kind of rips apart. So that'd be my point. Thanks.
Fantastic. Yes, clear strategic alignment amongst all of the partners. Well, with that, David, thank you very much. Marion, thank you. Amy Rose, Thank you, Debbie. Thank you. Maybe a virtual round of applause. There's a reactions button. You can press a virtual round of applause if you wish to. And thank you all very much indeed for a very, very insightful discussion. I've learned a huge amount from that. Thank you. Over to you, Jenny.
Great. Thank you ever so much to all our speakers. I just wanted to thank them all for their frank responses as well, because I think it's so important to understand the challenges that there are in moving along this journey, and I think that will be very helpful to everybody who's participated today. So thank you also to participants for signing in and adding your questions in the chat box as well. Just a reminder, if you would like to be included on the networking contact list, then please drop your email address into the Zoom group chat before you sign out, and we'll make sure we collate those and send them round. So it's an opt-in. We won't share your details without your consent. We'll make sure that recording as well is available, so if you have any colleagues that wanted to listen to this, we'll share that with you in the coming days as well, so you can circulate it. And please do get in touch with us if you'd like to talk any more about this programme, or if things have occurred to you, you think actually TPI should really be looking at this and we didn't talk about it much in during the session, then please do let us know. If you're a foundation and you're interested in getting more involved in the programme, then of course very welcome to contact us and talk to us about that as well. But likewise, if you're a partner organisation and you have thoughts for the kind of tools and things that would be helpful that we could develop for the second phase of the programme from September, then we'd love to hear from you. The sector report from the inquiry phase will be out in September 2020, so look out for that. And thank you once again, everybody, and I wish you a good rest of your day.